All right, a subscriber asked me a question, gdot, asked me a question about Vern Poythress hermeneutical factors determining the beginning of the 70 weeks of Daniel 9:24 through 27. So in my paper, the 7-year period of Great Tribulation fallacy, a look at the Messianic prophecy of Daniel 9:24 through 27. The question comes up, and my paper is written against dispensational futurism, which I believe Vern Poythress also writes against dispensationalism. But it's about this 70 weeks, Daniel 9:24 through 27. 70 weeks are decreed about your people. So here's what we're going to focus on. From the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. So this 70 weeks, or 490 literal years, day equals year principle is what we're utilizing here. The day equals year principle, 70 weeks equals 490 years. Starts from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem. Dispensational futurists say that the first 69 weeks, or 483 years, was fulfilled in the first century, but there is a huge time gap between the end of the 69th and beginning of the 70th week. That is absolute nonsense. You cannot insert an arbitrary time gap in any of the time-specific prophecies of either Daniel or Revelation, the two apocalyptic books of Scripture par excellence, one in the Old Testament, one in the New. Daniel is called greatly beloved by God, and John is called the disciple whom Jesus loved. So both these two, Daniel and John, who writes the book of Revelation, were both called beloved by God. But the dispensational futurists insert a time gap between the end of the 69th and beginning of the 70th week, a time gap which has been thus far almost 2,000 years. That's sheer nonsense. According to the day equals year principle, it's 490 literal years. Major flaw in the dispensational futurist view is their time gap between the end of the 69th and beginning of the 70th week. So that they can say God's plan for the Jews is not yet complete because they still have 7 years left. The 70th week equals 7 years for God to work through them. So I'm gonna go down to the four possible commencement dates. Of course, this is the dispensational futurist eschatological system. The errors: pre-trib rapture followed by a 7-year period of great tribulation. This is taken from a fallacious interpretation of Daniel 9:24 through 27 in the 70 weeks time prophecy, during which time the Antichrist will arise. All kinds of falsehoods, errors, and lies that go into this 70th week nonsense that we hear all the time. The Great Tribulation is 7 years. They get that from Daniel 9:24 through 27 from no other text. They then read into other texts their false theory of a future fulfillment of the 70th week. Okay, so it's all kinds of confusion going on in the dispensational futurist eschatological system. Let's go over to Vern Poythress' article right here, here's framepoythress.org, hermeneutical factors in determining the beginning of the 70 weeks, published in a Trinity Journal, 1985 originally. Alternative dates. So the problem here with Dr. Poythress is that he will only give 2 possible decrees, only 2. Most conservative interpreters have identified the decree either as the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, in about 538 BC. So here's my paper. Cyrus, about 538/537, depending on what calendar Daniel is using, either the Babylonian or the Hebrew one. He could be using either one. In Ezra 1 through 4, Ezra 6, 3 through 5, and 2 Chronicles 36, 22 through 23. The decree of Darius in about 520 BC, which Dr. Poythress will also mention Darius. The first decree of Artaxerxes in 457, really 458/457 BC, and Ezra 7. This will be the one that I fixate on right here, is the third one. Not the decree of Cyrus, but the first decree of Artaxerxes. And then dispensational futurists typically fixate on the second decree of Artaxerxes, which was actually not an official royal decree, but simply passport letters given to Nehemiah chapter 2, to take his journey from Babylon over to the province beyond the river, that is Judah, to do some repair work to a city that had already been undergoing reconstruction for about 13 years before Nehemiah made his journey. In fact, his repair work only took 52 days. But these are the 4 possible commencement dates. So in this paper, Dr. Poythress will only give 2 potential decrees. There are, in fact, 4, not just 2. The decree of Cyrus and the decree of Artaxerxes in Nehemiah chapter 2, which again, 445, 444 BC, which was not an official royal decree, but just passport letters given to Nehemiah to take his journey. So he will recognize that dispensational futurists actually focus on this Nehemiah chapter 2, 444 or 445/444 BC. And he is right about that. So 69 weeks equals 483 years. Amen. Total agreement with that. Total agreement with Dr. Poythress. Day equals year principle. And the problem is here, 69 weeks, add 483 years to the king of Cyrus. If you add that, you come to about, if you add 483 years to this proposed commencement date of Cyrus, you come to about 55/54 BC, which is way too early for the time of the Messiah. Way too early. The fourth one here, the decree that of Artaxerxes, which was not an official royal decree, but passport letters, you add 483 years to that, you come to about 38 or 39 AD, which is, again, way too late for the triumphal entry and subsequent crucifixion of Christ, which scholars generally recognize that the crucifixion took place in either about 30 AD, I fixate on a 30 AD date for the crucifixion, or about 33 AD at the latest for the crucifixion of Christ, not 38 or 39 AD. Now, dispensational futurists try to reconcile that by saying, well, the Jews only used a 360-day year, and that's what Dr. Poythress will point out way down here under section 6, under the next section 7. Yeah, argument for finding wall building. Okay, wait, no, maybe it's the later one. No, 8. Let's see here. He's going to talk about Harold Hoehner and Sir Robert Anderson, and I just want to make sure where does he talk about it? Sir Robert Anderson and Harold Hoehner, Jubilees. Impressive. Okay, the impressive precision of the 4. It's not impressively precise. It's not. It's actually too late, because Sir Robert Anderson and Harold Hoehner both assumed that the Jews only used a 360-day yearly calendar. 360 days long, years that are all 360 days long. And they did use a 360-day practical calendar, but what the Jews would do, these people were not dumb. Okay, they knew that their lunar monthly calendar of technically 29 and a half days, but 30 days each, because they used inclusive reckoning, so a half day would equal a full day. Okay, so similar to when Jesus says, as Jonah was 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the whale, so shall the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Well, Jesus was crucified on a Friday, in the grave on Saturday, and on a high Sabbath that year, and then was resurrected by Sunday morning. But he said 3 days and 3 nights. Well, for the Jews, utilizing inclusive reckoning meant that if you died just 5 minutes before sundown, that was day 1. That was a day and a night. That was a full day, okay? Inclusive reckoning. So 29 and a half days of a lunar monthly calendar equals 30 days. So 12 months of 30 days is 360 days for a year. However, the Jews reconciled because they recognized the lunar monthly calendar did not coincide with the solar yearly calendar. What the Jews would do is add an entire month to their calendar every 6th year to make up for the discrepancy between the lunar monthly and the solar yearly calendar. So they recognized every year for 6 years, they lost 5 days. And so they had to add every 6th year, they had 13 months of 30 days to make up. That was their leap year, to make up for the discrepancy between the lunar monthly and the solar yearly calendar. Hopefully that makes sense. There's a lot of stuff to deal with here. And Dr. Poythress, I think, does a pretty good job. And Okay, wait now. Does anyone seriously want to contend that the figures of this type were intended to be understood in terms of 360-day years instead of solar years? Yep. See, that's what Honer and Sir Robert Anderson and Harold Honer tried to do, because they knew that their math didn't add up with the 445/444 BC date for 483 years. You add 483 years to that date, you come to 38/39 AD. Okay, so here's the math here. Let me scroll down here. Cyrus decree 538/537, add 438 years, 69 weeks, takes us to 55/54 BC. This decree does not fulfill the time of the Messiah. It's too early. Likewise, the decree of Darius, which was just a reiteration of the one of Cyrus, was 520 BC. Dr. Poythress will point this out too. But it brings us to 37 BC, which is still way too early for the time of the Messiah. I'm going to jump past the third one and go to the fourth one that dispensational futurists mostly use from Nehemiah chapter 2. But 445, 444 BC, add 483 years to that, and you come to 38 or 39 BC. Way too late for the triumphal entry of Christ. And that's what Sir Robert Anderson and people like Harold Honer, they do recognize the discrepancy there. And so they have to insist that the Jews never reconciled their calendar. They only ever used a strict 360-day yearly calendar. And I'm saying, no, they didn't. Okay, they did not. They did for practical purposes, but they reconciled that discrepancy by adding an entire month to their calendar every 6th year to make up for the discrepancy. Okay, hopefully that makes sense, that part of it. But if you go from the decree of Artaxerxes from Ezra chapter 7, 458/457 BC, add 483 years to that, you come to 26/27 AD, which is the perfect time for the baptism of Jesus Christ by John the Baptist and the starting point of the fulfillment of the 70th week. Jesus, with his 3 to 3.5 year ministry, fulfills the first part of the 70th week, and then the subsequent, after the crucifixion, death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, the subsequent 3 to 3.5 years of the 70th week, because it's 7 years long, was fulfilled by the apostles, primarily preaching still to the Jews, not going out to the rest of the world yet, still preaching primarily to the Jews. And then ended with the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen was the last prophet to the Jews. Let me do this. The 70th week of Daniel included the baptism. It started at the baptism of Jesus, the beginning of his earthly ministry, and then his whole earthly ministry, his crucifixion, roughly 3 to 3.5 years into his earthly ministry, his resurrection, ascension into heaven, Acts chapter 1, 9 through 11, and Revelation 12, 5, and the subsequent 3.5 years of the apostles' ministry primarily to the Jews. Remember, this whole 70 weeks of Daniel was for your people, Daniel, for your people, the Jews, which ended at the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen was the last prophet to the Jews. Acts chapter 7, Stephen gives a covenantal lawsuit against unbelieving Jews, similar to the way the prophets of old used to, bringing a covenantal lawsuit against unbelieving Jews. And not only that, but it's very interesting, Stephen is actually the first church historian. Even before Luke. We think of Luke as the church historian par excellence of Scripture. Actually, Stephen was. Stephen did a whole church history before Luke did. Of course, Luke is writing in Acts chapter 7 as an historian himself, but Stephen gives a church history. So let's go back once again. Let me just point out why. So look, if anybody wants to talk about the start date of the decree for Daniel 9:24 through 27 and doesn't bring up these 4 possible commencement dates, just think to yourself, hey man, why are you not including all 4 of these potential potential decrees? The decree of Cyrus, the decree of Darius. Okay, let's examine each one of these. The royal decree of Cyrus only dealt with the building of the temple or house of God. Now, people will go to Isaiah, and Dr. Poythress does do this. He goes to Isaiah and says, well, it says Cyrus will build my city or rebuild my city. Yes, the actual decree of Cyrus only dealt with the temple or the house of God. But remember that Cyrus represented the entire Medo-Persian Empire as its king, really king of kings at the time. Similar to Nebuchadnezzar back in the Babylonian Empire, he was called. Daniel calls him King of Kings. You king, O King of Kings. Okay, so Cyrus would be the new King of Kings over an empire, the Medo-Persian Empire. So anything that was done after him by any subsequent kings was still a part of the kingdom of what Cyrus was once the King of Kings of, if that makes sense. So the Isaiah prophecy is true, but it wasn't the actual literal Cyrus who did the literal decreed the literal rebuilding of the city. He started everything. So if it wasn't for Cyrus, Artaxerxes never would have done this decree in Ezra chapter 7 for Ezra to appoint magistrates and judges. This is an official royal decree to appoint magistrates and judges that would give the Jews a certain amount of political autonomy and building up a body politic that they had not had since the Babylonian captivity in the time of Jeremiah, and that what Jeremiah prophesied about. So this decree of Artaxerxes was huge, but this decree wouldn't have ever happened if it wasn't for Cyrus initiating all of this. So Cyrus the Great, he is called the Great in history for a reason. This is another reason to do apologetics with Jews, at least believing Jews, those who claim to believe in the Old Testament. That is the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, and the Ketuvim. Because we can go right to Daniel 9, 24 through 27 and show that Jesus of Nazareth was in fact the Messiah and that they should believe in him. Okay? This is a great way to do apologetics with believing Jews, not atheistic. There are plenty of atheistic Jews who don't believe in any of the Tanakh, the Torah, the Nevi'im, or the Ketuvim, the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. But believing Jews are supposed to be reading Daniel, and we should go right to Daniel 9, 24 through 27, and then all these decrees and point out to them how Jesus was the Messiah. So, the first royal decree of Artaxerxes, Ezra chapter 7, 458/457 BC. This is the one right here, Ezra chapter 7. Ezra chapter 7, not the decree of Cyrus, which only dealt with the house of God. The decree of Darius was only a reiteration of the decree of Cyrus, thus it only had to do with the building of the temple. The first royal decree of Artaxerxes, royal decree allowed Ezra to appoint magistrates who may judge, teach the law of your God. Whoever shall not obey the law of your God, let judgment be strict. So judges and magistrates, and this would assume that all these judges and magistrates would have to have places from which to fulfill their administrative duties, namely the building up of a city. And again, this gives them a certain amount of political autonomy that they had not had since the captivity. The decree of Artaxerxes in Nehemiah was not an official royal decree of Nehemiah chapter 2, but rather consisted of passport letters given to Nehemiah to present to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me, Nehemiah, pass through until I come to Judah. So the Nehemiah letter by Artaxerxes was to engage in repair work to the gates of the temple and city wall, which had apparently been damaged by some overzealous Samaritans who were opposing the rebuilding of the rebellious city, Ezra 4:12 and other places in Ezra and Nehemiah. But what of the talk in Nehemiah 2 that says, if it pleases the king, Artaxerxes, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's grave, that I may rebuild it? Doesn't this decree have something to do with the rebuilding of the city? Answer, no. Okay, no. Apparently the city had already been undergoing reconstruction for roughly 13 years before Nehemiah's appeal to Artaxerxes and subsequent mission to Jerusalem. It appears that Ezra had inferred that from the first decree made by Artaxerxes, a royal decree, not just simply passport letters, it allowed him to appoint magistrates and judges, and that these magistrates and judges would need to have a place from which to fulfill their administrative duties. And that, in fact, they had already been undergoing reconstruction of the city proper. By the time Nehemiah came to Jerusalem, Nehemiah's repair work only took 52 days. See Nehemiah 6:15. Hardly enough time to complete the rebuilding of an entire city. Okay? Ezra 4, we have recorded a number of issues the Jews faced from primarily Samaritan adversaries in rebuilding not only the temple, but the city itself. Okay, so it's interesting that when Jesus comes along some, 500 years later at the first Advent, 400 some odd years later, that when Jesus gives the parable of the, quote, Good Samaritan, that was scandalous to the Jews to hear that, because the Samaritans and the Jews had real bad blood between them. The Samaritans were causing all kinds of problems with the returning Jews. In Ezra 4, 7 through 23, the Samaritans even wrote a letter to King Artaxerxes saying in part that the Jews were rebuilding that rebellious and wicked city, and that if this city is rebuilt and its walls finished, you will have no possession in the province beyond the river because they are a rebellious people. So some propaganda going on back and forth there. CIA, KGB type stuff. The often erratic Artaxerxes did cause reconstruction to cease for a time until further notice. But rather than the letters given to Nehemiah, as recorded in Nehemiah chapter 2, it is the royal decree of Artaxerxes given in 457, 458 BC that best fits the beginning for the prophecy. And again, all we have to do is do some math. Cyrus decree, add 483 years, 55/54 BC. Do the math. Way too late for the Nehemiah chapter 2. So I think that's about it. Just 360 days. No, they're the years are to be calculated as normal solar years, not 360-day long years, because of the Jewish reconciliation. So 7 times 62. Okay, 400. Yeah, he's going through some of that. So a lot of good stuff here in Poythress, but he is wrong to assert that there is only, 2 decrees, the one from Cyrus and then the letters, the passport letters of Artaxerxes. And I think that's about it. 20 minutes. Let me know if that is substantive enough. Yeah, he goes through Isaiah here. Let it be rebuilt, of Jerusalem. Okay, of Cyrus, right? But remember, Cyrus represents the whole Medo-Persian Empire. So any other king that came after him who added to what Cyrus had already started would be considered to be under the same kingdom, the same empire of Cyrus. So Artaxerxes, going back to Cyrus, it would be very similar to that. We ought not take an overly literalistic approach and recognize that, kings represent kingdoms. Okay, kings always represent their kingdoms. So Cyrus decree and prophecy in history. Yeah, good decree. 538 or 444, and that's false to just point out those two without pointing out the other 2 potential ones. The decree of Cyrus, yes, that's great. The second decree of Artaxerxes, that's fine, but you have to include the decree of Darius, was just a reiteration of Cyrus, and this official royal decree of Artaxerxes. And you will find that in many historicist writings about Daniel 9, 24 through 27. Many of them did start with this decree of Artaxerxes in 458/457 BC. I should probably put 458/450/457 would be a more accurate way to write it. I'm going to save that. So I hope this is helpful to gdot. It is a really good question, and it's super in depth, and it it takes a lot of like going through this whole thing. Man, I should remake a video about it. Did about 5 years ago. 4 possible start dates. I'll look for the video. Couldn't find it. But yeah, it was called Tribulation Fallacies. 7-year Tribulation Fallacies, or just Tribulation Fallacies, because they get the 7 years of Great Tribulation from Daniel 9, 24 through 27 in this mythical future 70th week, 7 years of Great Tribulation. If you take requests, any interaction with Poythress article, yep, I do the best I can, obviously. But I just want to give the major points of what Poythress was talking about. Maybe you could link me. Yeah, I needed the link. I had to find the link, but it is right here. The John Frame and Vern Poythress, two pretty heavy hitters in the Reformed community. John Frame, nothing but respect for both of these men. Westminster Theological Man. I should write a paper for the. I should incorporate my paper and what I've written into this article, and that'd be kind of cool. And then great thanks. I understand it's large article. Yep, it's a large article. The millennium though, it's not really talked about in that article. The millennium is a subject for a whole different situation. Daniel 9:24 through 27 is messianic. It has nothing to do with the Antichrist. Nothing at all. This is all about Jesus Christ, not the Antichrist. There are plenty of other prophecies that talk about the Antichrist. Daniel 9:24 through 27 is not one of them. So I'm going to end it because now I'll just get on rambling about the Antichrist and all that. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I hope that was rather substantive. Let me know. Talk to you soon. Lord willing, Soli Deo Gloria.